My name is James Kruth. I work at AIS for tech services. I'm a developer there. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mercurial today. Now, first, in the interest of full disclosure, I want to say that when I jumped into DVCS, I started off using Mercurial. And eventually, because of mostly social pressure, I switched over to Git. So I've used both systems. I currently use Git, but I do have some experience with Mercurial. So the first question is, what is Mercurial? It's a DVCS. It's very much like Git. It provides nearly the same functionality as Git. It was written in Python as opposed to C, and it was started at the same time for the same reasons as Git. Like Carl mentioned, back, I believe it was in 2005, there was a controversy with the BitKeeper version control software. And the author of Mercurial decided that he was going to write a replacement for BitKeeper a few days after Linus Torvalds decided he was going to write a replacement for BitKeeper. So the projects ran in parallel, and because of this, because they were trying to fill the same void, they have many of the same features. They act almost identically in a lot of cases, down to the point where a lot of the command line commands are almost identical as well. And so you can switch from one to the other fairly easily. And so this talk is going to be mostly about what makes Mercurial different from Git, more of a comparison talk than anything else. And I'm going to not have any examples because you've already seen lots of examples, and frankly, the examples that you've seen, I would be typing the exact same commands as Brian was typing just a few minutes ago. So there is a never-ending holy war, Mercurial versus Git. This is actually turned into the new Emacs versus VI flame war. If you go out to Stack Overflow or any common discussion sites, you're going to see a lot of people who really like Mercurial, a lot of people who really like Git, who are arguing about the very, very fine points that make them different. They're about 98% equivalent, and this may surprise some of you because I'm doing a Mercurial presentation, but you probably should use Git unless you've got a good reason to use Mercurial. Now we'll get into that a little bit later, but in general, there was a war over the past 5 or 6 years, and from a social mindshare perspective, Git has really won that war. But there are still good reasons to use Mercurial, and we're going to talk about some of those. First is operating system compatibility. Mercurial, unlike Git, has excellent native Windows support. It actually works well on any system that runs Python because Mercurial was written almost entirely in Python. It doesn't require MSys or Cygwin. Those are compatibility layers for Windows, which if you're going to run Git on Windows, you're going to need to be running one of these layers. Now they're easy to install, but it still is a little bit something sitting between you and your system. Also, my understanding is that Tortoise HG, the Tortoise basically handles almost any kind of version control. It's a graphical tool for handling version control. Tortoise HG is apparently a little more stable, a little more mature on Windows than Tortoise Git, mostly because of the lack of that native Windows support for Git. Git still needs that compatibility layer. It uses Linux kernel calls at its core. On the community support front, Mercurial is a little bit lacking. There is one book on Mercurial and maybe one more that's going to be published sometime soon. There's no date on it. Git has actually several books out at this point. Mercurial also has about half as many hits on Google as Mercurial does. And the Mercurial community, while being very helpful, is definitely smaller than the Git community. One thing I can attest to, though, is that Mercurial's mailing lists and IRC servers are definitely a bit more of a friendly place than Git's IRC channels and mailing lists. In general, the Git users tend to tell you to suck it up and deal with the way Git works, and the Mercurial users tend to be a little bit more receptive to criticism. Mercurial has quite a few hosted repo options, just like all of the other version control systems. Bitbucket is the premier system. It was recently purchased by Atlassian, and when that happened, I believe when that happened, they changed the terms of use a little bit, so academic accounts receive free unlimited private repos. So if you're interested in hosting source code off-site and you'd like to use a nice tool to use it, Bitbucket may be the way to go. And that's one thing that stands out over Git. GitHub, I believe, has some sort of an academic package, but it's apparently a big secret, and they don't really like to talk about it too much. There are also open source options, SourceForge, which you've all heard of, Google Code, and there are many others out there as well. There are some technical differences. Mercurial is more of, I guess the best way to put this is Mercurial is an application for managing, source control. Git is a set of utilities that allows you to design a source control management tool, and it just so happens that someone has done that and it comes with those tools. And so because of that difference in philosophy, you can do a lot more with Git, but there are some rough edges. Mercurial has been designed to be as easy and as intuitive as possible to new users. And actually, my third bullet down there sort of highlights that difference. You can see we've got a Git command and then a Mercurial command that do the exact same thing. Now the Git command is a bit more verbose and maybe a bit less evident as to what it does. They both reset your repository to the state of the last commit. Mercurial also doesn't have a big component of Git, which is a staging area. I didn't really understand when I switched to Git what the purpose of the staging area was. It just seemed actually sort of like an added step that I didn't want to have to deal with. Now I actually don't know what I would do without it. The staging area is something that allows you to be maybe working on 2 or 3 different tasks in your repository at the same time, and you can stage up one of those tasks to be committed while the other 2 sit in the repository. And so you aren't always committing all of the changed files in your repositories, or maybe even all of the changes in one file in a repository. You can actually stage a chunk of one file. Now Mercurial will support this as well, but it's plugin functionality. You'll find that Mercurial has a lot of plugins that really attempt to make it cover that last little 2% and make it almost exactly like Git. Really, the only other big difference between these two things, unless we're going to get into very, very deep details, is that Mercurial is not quite as fast as Git. It is written in Python. Python is a scripting language. C is always going to be a little faster. But that's not really going to be an issue for you unless you're dealing with, a very, very large project, say like 20,000 files or so. I would bet most of us don't deal with projects that large, and so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. So why would you use Mercurial if Git and Mercurial are about the same thing anyway? Well, if you can't or don't want to run MSys or Cygwin on Windows, if you're working in a Python shop and you really just want to use Python-based tools, one thing that is nice about Mercurial is it's much easier to make modifications to Mercurial than it is to make modifications to Git. Git is a collection of C programs, Perl scripts, all sorts of different things. Mercurial is just Python code, and if you're comfortable with that, that may be a good option for you. If you have an aversion to the command line, really the best way I found to use Git is using the command line. I would say that most of the graphical tools, while they work, they aren't as nice of an experience, at least not for me. The Mercurial graphical tools seem to work a little bit better. And finally, if you're like the underdog, if you happen to have a Betamax player at your house, any of those things, you might want to use Mercurial. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation here. As I said, there aren't a lot of differences between these two version control systems. I just wanted to run over, some of the main points, and I guess I'd like to, at this point, open up for questions in the panel.